tiram. Tem as pessoas que estão inscritas e a pessoa que entra em cima da hora. Então, hoje, a gente vai também dar uma audiência para esse assunto e para esse cara genial que ninguém dá. E quando dá cobrando o negócio. Não, aqui é o seguinte, para a gente informar, faz parte da missão do ICL fazer o conhecimento chegar para todo mundo. O que cada um vai fazer com o conhecimento, aí, Chico, meu irmão, é o caminho de cada um.
Mas é o caminho de libertação.
É o caminho de cada um.
É o caminho da libertação.
É claro.
Instituto Conhecimento Liberta.
Mas no momento que a gente quer falar o que o cara tem que fazer, aí a gente parou de cumprir a nossa missão. A gente tem que levar o conhecimento e tornar ele acessível. Então vocês vão ter uma aula incrível, que começa daqui a 3 minutos, acessível. Você que entrou agora, eu já peço, se você está no Facebook, dá aí um compartilhamento. Se você está nos assistindo pelo YouTube, poxa, é legal, além de dar o like, aliás, muita gente quando assiste uma aula dessa, nunca entrou no nosso canal. A gente tem vários programas como esse que estava acontecendo, acabou de terminar o ICL Notícias segunda edição. Somos líderes de audiência na internet brasileira, batendo os principais canais de mídia, da grande mídia. Então a gente bate CNN, bate Band News, bate Record News, bate essa turma toda e com um trabalho que é o seguinte, é único no mundo. Não existe no planeta nenhum canal de notícias sem propaganda do tamanho do ICL. Né? Não existe em nenhum lugar. E a gente precisa que isso chegue para todo mundo. Então, primeiro, se você está chegando aqui a primeira vez, se inscreve aqui no canal, só clicar em se inscrever, não tem que pagar nada, você vai ter acesso a tudo isso, sem propaganda, né? Você não vai achar isso em nenhum lugar com a turma como Calejão, Robertinha, Chico Pinheiro, Chico Sá, Jamil Chad, Guilherme Amado, Cristina Serra, Heloísa Vilela, é um grupo de pessoas assim. Quem? Juca Kifur, é muita gente boa. É muito Gessé Souza, é muita gente boa. Então, se inscreve aqui no canal e agora, pega e que durante começou a aula você vai ficar tão entretido ali com o negócio, tão atento, você não vai mais pensar em nada. Então pega agora, por favor, o link, manda nos teus grupos de WhatsApp, nos teus grupos de Telegram, fala assim, galera, tá começando essa aula, não deixa de assistir, é imperdível. É a ajuda que a gente pede para as pessoas. Uma aula como essa, ela tem um custo de quase R$500 mil para organizar, né? Quem banca isso são os alunos e alunas dos cursos do ICL. Lembrando que a gente já está com 67 mil alunos, dos quais 25 mil são bolsistas integrais. Não pagam nem um centavo, que vem através de Educafro, através do MST, através de Uni, através de associação, de sindicatos, do Instituto Barrichello, do Instituto Gaia Mais. São mais de 50 parceiros. São mais de 50 parceiros.
Pagam R$47 por mês para ter direito a 200
E são os que pagam. Esses que eu estou falando são de graça. Esses que eu estou falando são de graça, de graça, de graça. Ou seja, quem não... Todo mundo tem que fazer parte do ICL. Todo mundo. Quem não pode pagar é de graça, vem através de uma instituição dessa. E quem pode pagar é o que o Chico Pinheiro estava falando. É o preço de um sanduíche para poder entrar. E hoje, no final, tem uma surpresa. Não dá. No final, tem uma surpresa. Quando terminar a aula dele, antes da parte que, para mim, é uma segunda aula, que a gente vai ter com Letícia Cesarino e Ronaldo Lemos, os dois maiores especialistas para muita gente também no Brasil, sobre esse tema. Aliás, Letícia Cesarino, com um curso espetacular no ICL, eu sou aluno desse curso, que chama O Mundo ao Avesso, né? Que fala sobre essa revolução das redes sociais. A gente vai fazer uma surpresa para vocês dos novos cursos que estão entrando, já são 215, e todo mundo que faz parte tem acesso a tudo, e tem um presente muito especial para quem quiser hoje, no final, entrar no ICL. Quem não quiser vai só curtir a aula, vai se divertir, vai ter um monte de conhecimento, é de graça, vai ter uma outra visão de mundo. Agora, quem quiser, hoje é o dia. Hoje é o dia, no final você vai entender o que eu estou falando e vai ficar feliz com as surpresas que a gente vai trazer. Então, sem mais delongas, te agradeço, César, Roberta, Chico, por me permitir entrar aqui no finalzinho do programa de vocês. E a vocês, deleitem-se, divirtam-se, aprendam com esse instituto que faz essa revolução no conhecimento. A gente vai fechar o chat agora, é aula, sala de aula, a conversa paralela se encerra para a gente poder prestar atenção no que o mestre tem a nos ensinar. Vamos lá, Brett King com vocês, Instituto Conhecimento Liberta. Hello, Mr. Brett King. Thanks for joining.
Obrigado. Nice to be with you.
It's a great honor to have you here with us.
And I'd like to start already with a question, which is about this perception that we have that we're living a unique and special moment of change in history. The question is, some people say that there's nothing unique in that because every time in history there's a change going on. So what we're living is just normal history. My question for you is this moment we're living a unique moment in terms of importance and intensity of change in the world?
Absolutely. And I'll let me defend that. Because we not only have artificial intelligence, which is akin to the invention of electricity or the printing press or the wheel or fire, it's a game changer. It's going to change everything. We not only have artificial intelligence, the first non-human intelligence of equivalence to our own intellect, if you like, potentially. Not only do we have that can sort of disrupt every industry simultaneously everywhere in the world at once over the next 10, 20 years. But at the same time, we're going to be dealing with the effects of climate change, which since the last ice age, humanity really hasn't had to deal with anything as severe as this in such a short period. We've known it's been coming for a while. We're woefully unprepared for it. And some of the issues related to climate change in terms of sea level rise, extreme temperatures, the loss of biodiversity, more pandemics that will come as a result of this, food scarcity problems, eco-refugees and so forth. Any one of these problems would be a game changer. And yet this is all coming all at once, combining artificial intelligence and the impact of climate. And of course, we have some of the highest inequality we've seen in history. That's not just, obviously Brazil has significant problems with inequality, but the United States, the UK, many countries are suffering from this. The US, Thomas Piketty said the US has the worst inequality of any modern economy at any time throughout history. He's the French economist. So, and that was obviously accentuated during the pandemic. So we do have some pretty significant issues. I would say that there's even the Industrial Revolution that we went through, I don't think is a good comparator or comparable for the rate of change that we're going to go in, because we're going to see the same sort of impact that we saw over 100 years with the Industrial Revolution. We're probably going to see in 20 years with AI. So it's a lot more compressed. That's a perception that it's kind of building, and people are starting to get anxious and at the same time afraid of what can happen with their lives. And the thing is, people usually get anxious for the change that technology can bring because they think how their lives can get better off. Unfortunately, these benefits never get to everyone. Just as an example, it's scary to realize that more than one century after Nikola Tesla, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Edison, you look to Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and more than 50% of people don't have access to electricity. Do you think that this change that we are testimony in technology, this change will make everyone's lives better, or these are changes that, again, will not affect everyone in a positive way? Well, the technology is agnostic. The technology doesn't have an intent. It doesn't have a bias, unless, of course, we code it into algorithms. So technology can be used for the good of all people. And when we look at something like artificial intelligence, the impact of AI, could be, for example, phenomenal advancements in healthcare available to everyone, reducing the cost of national healthcare by 60-70% over the next 20 years. Ubiquitous high-quality education, access to improving the cost of government and the quality of services, et cetera, et cetera. So technology could produce benefits across society, longevity, extended lives, better communication, and of course creating immense wealth that, if distributed properly, could raise the quality of life for everyone. But that would require us to do some fundamental rethinking of the way our current economies and markets work. And so I've written about this recently in my latest book, which is called The Rise of Techno-Socialism. And in that, we talk about 4 potential models that are outcomes. And one model is the Luddistan model, where we reject AI because of the increase in unemployment that it creates, the disruption it creates in terms of traditional labor force and things like that. That we see people toying with that at the moment. We see some restrictions coming on AI, but you could see economies outright ban AI because of its impact. That would be ultimately, I think, bad for humanity, because the opportunities AI gives us in terms of advancements are significant. Then you've got the failed state scenario, which we call Faildistan in the book, which is where we just waited too long to respond to these changes because everyone was still arguing whether AI was going to take jobs or whether climate change was going to be as bad as we think it was. And by the time these things happen, we just haven't done enough preparation. Fortunately, those 2 outcomes are probably less likely than the 2 that we're seeing playing out on the world scene. One is sort of a supercharged capitalism based on AI, which would be sort of the US model, which we call neo-feudalism in the book, where technology is centered around ownership. The corporations that have control of these technologies create immense pools of wealth, but distribution of this is problematic. So it creates sort of a ruling class, a feudal class, if you like, of technologists. But the scenario we argue is the optimal outcome for humanity is one where we use technology to reduce the cost of government, improve the quality of lives for every citizen, where we really reprioritize the economy around the citizens. So techno-socialism, as we put in the book, is not classic socialism. It's not workers owning the means of production. It's citizens owning the output of the economy. But the economy, first and foremost, caters for the needs of the citizens. After that, the basic needs of citizens are taken care of, food, clothing, housing, healthcare, education, and so forth. After that, then the corporations, can be considered. And that means we have to start thinking about growth and, GDP and all of these classic economic terms very differently as AI and climate change, start to come in. We have to start measuring the success of our systems differently from the way we have in the past if we're going to succeed with that. So that's the problem, is to have the benefit of all of these technologies across society more broadly. We have to see a philosophical change in the way human governance and systems work.
That's where my concern comes, because when I look at where we're heading to, it seems like the world it's getting controlled by private monopolies, and I think it's so dangerous, because when you look today at the way how people interact, not only on their personal affairs but also professionally, this is all at the end coming to Google, Amazon, WhatsApp, Facebook, which are private monopolies. And as being private companies, those are companies which have like one priority, which is profit for the shareholders.
Right.
How see a world where this artificial intelligence and other technologies means power, and at the same time we have like private monopolies giving the cards. Isn't this like a really dangerous combination? Or
well, I do think that already the pendulum is shifting a little bit, where corporations that don't have a social mission, that are purely profit machines, and that do bad things to create profits, are getting called out. For example, Facebook with Cambridge Analytica, or banks that are funding fossil fuels and things like this. We see more attention on these corporations to ensure they have a social mission. And that's going to get even more important as these large tech companies start to deploy AI that can put human workers out of jobs. Think of things like autonomous vehicles which you don't need truck drivers for, delivery, gigging economy workers that are replaced by robots and drones, et cetera, right? People working in back offices of accounting firms and banks and, things like that at risk from these things. As you start to have that happen, obviously people are going to be saying, you can't just get rid of all of these human jobs without worrying about the impact of this technology and providing some way for people to transition. So that's one side of it. Secondly, the effects of climate change are going to be seen, and they're going to be very real. And the corporations that falsified climate data and muddied the water on that, like the fossil fuel companies who subsidized reports that tried to hide the real damage of climate and so forth. I absolutely think that they would be held to account as the climate worsens. So what you need to have happen in this environment, if you're a corporation, just making a ton of money is not going to be enough to have the support of the broader public. You're going to have a social mission as well. So I think, like we have today, the earlier efforts at ESG and carbon neutrality and things like that, I think you're going to see a whole lot of measures, sustainability being an important measure. I think when you look at a company's performance, you're not just going to see their share price, whether it's gone up or down. You're also going to see these other metrics that measure whether that corporation is, on a net basis, a good for the community. I do think that sort of approach is probably, I think that's the way to do it. That's the way that comes in. But part of this is also policy setting. And what we see right now, particularly in places like the United States and in Brazil, you can have these large corporations have massive effect on policy setting, and through paying for politicians, as an example. And this enables them to sort of rig the system, as we've seen with fossil fuel companies, the NRA with gun ownership in the States and so forth. And this is a significant problem when you need to make change that undermines their traditional industries. Like, for example, we're going to need to shift to renewables en masse, and that is going to affect the fossil fuel industry. And we've seen for the last 20 years resistance from these lobbying groups in terms of real policy change. So you need to have the community, the power of the crowd, be very forcible in this instance to make these real changes. And so I'm hopeful that will happen, and I'm hopeful to some extent that it is a bit of a generational shift. I don't think our children will be as concerned about maintaining capitalism in its current form as the current generation of leadership is. I think many of our children will say, well, what has capitalism given us? It's given us climate change. It's given us technology based on employment. It's given us homelessness and inequality. We need something better. So I'm hopeful that there will be a sea change. But it's sort of 50-50, to be honest, Eduardo.
I have to agree. I have to agree. And I was with this 50-50 in my mind when you were talking, because two things came to my mind. One is that we organized here in Brazil a financial operation to fund the peasants movement, the no land movement in Brazil, to finance their production of organics and sustainable production. And we got thousands of people that wanted to invest in them at a rate which is half of the rate that big companies get money lent to them. So it was amazing, and it showed that people are already not worried only with the financial return. They're worried about the environmental return,
Right.
the social return. But at the same time, we are in a week in Brazil where the Congress has passed a law which means a genocide for our indigenous communities in Brazil. And they're doing that because out of the 500 congressmen we have in Brazil, about 300 are elected, financed by the large farmers in Brazil that want the indigenous people's land. So it's hard to
I hear you.
to guess what will happen with so much power on the hands of people that make the policies. So I kind of agree with you about with this 50-50.
There's a great series on Apple TV. I don't know whether you've watched it, called Extrapolations.
The first two episodes, yes.
Excuse me. And that really, goes out to 2070, and it really shows how a world controlled by corporations in terms of policy setting, the amount of damage that will do to the planet and the species, in terms of loss of biodiversity and so forth, right? And so that is, we need more education of people to understand that capitalism was an extraordinarily successful tool to help us get to this point. But right now, with both AI and climate change coming upon us, and the problem of inequality and pandemics and so forth, these rolling crises, that we need a system today that doesn't force us to compete against each other, but it forces us to compete for each other. And that's where I think the change needs to happen in terms of our value systems. That we need to align the corporations that we have, the markets that we have, the policy that we have. The first and most important question should always be, how does this make the world a better place for humanity? And if we have a measure where it doesn't, but it produces enormous profit, then those things need to be filtered out, because ultimately that's where we've made our mistake the last couple of hundred years in having those perverse incentives, as economists would call it. So, for an example, we knew since the 1970s that fossil fuel-based air pollution in major cities was killing 10 million people a year. And we could have accelerated the development of renewable energy systems and so forth. We could have been completely renewable based in terms of our power systems by the year 2000 if we'd committed to that in the 1970s. And we didn't. Why? Because fossil fuel companies were making a ton of money for the market. And that's the sort of imbalance that we have in the current system. And a lot of people, in the United States and where I'm from in Australia, in Brazil, defend capitalism like it's their religion. Like, how dare you? Are you a socialist? Are you a communist attacking capitalism? But I attack it this way. I say, well, listen, in 10,000 years, let's say humanity survives this period. In 10,000 years, do you think capitalism will be the very best system that humans have ever been able to come up with? And the answer is obviously no, right? We're going to obviously find something better. So then the question is, why wait for 10,000 years? Why not start to make an improvement now?
Perfect. Let me tell you something. I used to be a trader on an investment bank before I did like a big shift in my life to study inequality and to dedicate my life to fight against inequality. But when I was a trader,
So you came from the dark side to the light side, huh?
Totally. I crossed the bridge on the unusual direction, because usually people cross the bridge to the other direction. But when back in that time, my friends from school and from life, they used to call me and say, Eduardo, please tell me some good stocks where I can invest my money. And I used to tell them, hey, I don't have a crystal ball, and there's no way to tell which stocks are the best. I can have an educated guess, but that's the best I can do. So now I will ask you, as one of the guys who have been able to predict the change in the world better, what are your best guesses about which jobs over the past 10 to 20 years will be on jeopardy, and which jobs should arise as good opportunities for people that are studying now and entering in their careers now?
So anything that is repetitive in nature, that will be the first thing to go, right? If you have a job that you have to teach another human a process, like a checklist that needs to be followed, and that is your job by definition, then we'll be able to teach an algorithm or a machine to do that. We may need to design, it may take a while for that, but that's the first area we're going to attack. Anything that's sort of repetitive in process, anything that's based on a decision matrix or decision tree to get to an outcome, that doesn't require creative thinking or innovative thinking in the mix, or problem solving. Those jobs are going to be the first to go, and then we're going to start attacking areas that are a bit more sophisticated. The other side of it is we are going to be looking at obviously efficiency gains from an economy perspective. So we're going to look at how do we make money flow easier, how do we make businesses work more efficiently together, and so the mechanisms we have for this are twofold. One, we're going to build smart economies and smart cities that have autonomous transportation systems, autonomous emergency services that have policing that's run with AI algorithms using cameras and so forth, which is obviously concern for some people. And then, on the other side, you are going to have, on the corporate side, the use of smart contracts, supply chain automation and so forth, where we're trying to make more efficient for companies to work together. And that eventually means that we have these marketplaces that are highly automated. In fact, maybe by the 2050s, half of our economy will run by AI, in a black box and in these spaces. So where humans will differentiate is where we have our creativity, where we, have our inspirational energies, where we are trying to stretch mankind, where we're trying to go beyond our current levels of understanding, where we're trying to explore and understand, the universe. And of course, one of the biggest growth areas will be in climate mitigation. So the one thing that could save us from techno-based unemployment based on AI is the jobs that climate change is going to create. So relocating people, the eco-refugee crisis, dealing with food scarcity, water quality problems from lots of flooding and sea level rise, making infrastructure climate resilient. So there's a ton of jobs there. Carbon sequestration, extracting carbon out of the atmosphere and so forth. So while there are, a lot of jobs at threat, there are definitely new opportunities created in this environment. But like you said at the start of our discussion, the chances are, because of the speed of this, that probably about 50% of the jobs in the economy today will disappear or be displaced by AI over the next 20 years.
And over the next 20 years?
Yeah. And so if you look at that, the speed of that is so fast that, for example, you got 5 million truck drivers in the United States, 2 million that just drive from the east side to the east coast to the west coast and do that trip regularly. What do you do with those 5 million truck drivers? Well, some would argue, well, you got to train them to code. Well, we are training AIs to code, and AIs will be able to code. So, that won't work. So what else can we train truck drivers to do? And how many of them want to be become coders, right? And so, you have a very real issue here where, you have to make a decision. Should we keep humans driving trucks? And the answer to that question will be no, because AI is going to obviously a lot cheaper, and that'll mean cheaper goods and services and things like that as well. So, there's not a lot of incentive to keep humans driving trucks, and so we do have to figure out what do we do with all these truck drivers, and that's just one profession, right? And this is going to be happening simultaneously in most industries at the same time. So we've never really had to deal. We've had specific technologies like the internet that's affected, a sector, like, for example, the experience layer, retail, commerce, for example, e-commerce, right? How we sell goods and services. And it affected a lot of industries across that top layer, but it was just that top layer. And the Industrial Revolution, well, that sort of really affected production and, the mechanization of production and industry. And so we've never really had something like AI that can affect all aspects of the corporation or market and all aspects of labor. That's the issue in this respect for AI.
And there's a concrete problem regarding exactly what you were saying in Brazil, in Europe, and many other countries, that we are approving reforms on the pension system, on the retirement system, which is making the minimum wage for you to retire each time higher. But the problem is that people are losing their jobs with 45, 50 years, and they're not, as you use the example of the truck driver, who would have to learn how to code. And those people with 50, 55 years, they're having a very hard time of finding new jobs or keeping up with these new technologies to find these new jobs. So they're left with no savings, at least here in Brazil, no savings, no retirement plan, and no jobs. How do we deal with that?
Well, this is why you hear all of these entrepreneurs like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and, Richard Branson, Bill Gates talk about universal basic income as a solution. And the argument is that AI will create so much wealth that the government, and government taxing algorithms and taxing robots will have all of this new revenue that will support, both retraining programs for people that want it and UBI for people that, are finding it difficult to make the transition. But this has problems of its own, in that it sort of creates that permanent class stratification between the owners of the technology infrastructure.
No social mobility at all anymore, right?
Recipients of UBI, right? So there is an advantage to UBI in that, you still have to make healthcare free and education free, essentially, for UBI to work. But you don't have any unemployment, and benefit schemes and retirement and pension you have to worry about anymore, because UBI covers all of that, right? On the same side, in the trials that we've seen for UBI around the world to date, some interesting things have happened. We see people start their own businesses when they receive UBI. They start their own businesses at 3 times the rate of the general population. We see 75% of UBI recipients get involved more in community activities around them. So UBI could have a very transformational effect on people. And here's the thing: is it would change the nature of work, because if you have a basic income that you receive, then you don't have to work just to put food on the table and a roof over your head. That sort of basic element of the function of your salary is taken care of. So then people could really explore, careers that they really want to do, and get more training and experiment with things, change their career frequently, things like that, without concerns about, I've got to do this job just to make a living, to survive, right? So there are elements of it that make a lot of sense, but there are some kinks to be worked out.
Great, and I have I have a really practical question, and I've been wanting to ask this question for like a specialist for quite some time. Now I have the opportunity about the legal implications of this AI, because when internet was launched, it became huge very fast, and the legal framework couldn't keep up with the pace of internet. So sometimes it became kind of a lawless land. And I have these questions about AI. For instance, a lot of people that I know now they're using Chat GPT or other softwares to ask what they should do. And this can become disastrous. For instance, someone can ask artificial intelligence software what they should do, and the outcome will be something that destroys their lives, literally. How will the legal framework keep up with this fast change that you're predicting for our lives with AI?
The first thing we need. Well, the first thing we need, of course, is we need some form of regulation for AI that gives it guide rails in terms of what actions that AI should be allowed to take. The EU framework for this is promising. In terms of they have different types of AI activities, and the way they're regulated depends on the type of activity. For example, if it has impact on a human life or could hurt someone, then obviously this is going to be regulated more significantly than AI that's a chatbot that's going to talk to you in customer service, right? But at the same time, we sort of need these ethical guide rails to make sure that we can give AI those moral and legal frameworks that matter in terms of execution. But the problem with this is it requires us to reach consensus on how we should encode those ethics. So, for example, in the United States, how are you going to decide on what the ethics that an AI algorithm in the healthcare system should have in respect to recommending care for a transgender child? You are not going to get agreement from humans in respect to what those ethical frameworks should be for the safe operation of AI in that scenario. So that's the problem, is it's not that AI represent a risk. It's that the rules that we need to give the AIs to reduce risk to humanity requires us to encode those in some sort of ethical framework. And this comes back, the legal question is very similar, because at the point where we start to let AI run our society more, for example, automate our cities and automate our healthcare industry and so forth. As we get to that point, what we have to do is we have to essentially make AIs that enforce the law, because those AIs have to be watching the other AIs to ensure compliance, right? So the regulatory function for AI will have to most likely be run by AI. And so what this requires is at that point, we have to take all the books of law that we have, all of the laws that we have in society, and we have to essentially code that into an AI-based justice system, and all the new regulations about AI and so forth in there as well. And at that point, we are going to have to decide which laws in the past that we want to include in the legal frameworks for, these AI-based compliance systems and so forth in the future. So this requires us also to filter the laws that we already have in place to make sure they're fit, for the future. Because as you've said, when we look at laws around, and we looked at laws around the impact of, the internet on things like copyright and identity and things like that, we're still dealing with those issues today, and certainly they're going to be issues in, we're going to see a lot of fake news problems. We're going to see, we're going to see videos of, politicians doing horrendous things that we won't know if it's a real video or fake, because it could have been AI generated. The complications that arise from this are significant. So unless we're prepared to do the hard work to actually encode those laws and create those ethical guide rails for AI, we are obviously going to have more problems.
But here's the thing. Some could say, well, Eduardo, but AI didn't appear from nowhere. Human invented the algorithms that get improved and become AI. So as our thought, our ideas are the inputs for AI, wouldn't AI just serve as a tool to consolidate the world as it is? Why should we expect AI to correct the world if it is made by the same people that brought us here in this world?
Well, we can't, right? That's the problem. But if you look at how AI works currently, machine learning, deep learning, the techniques we use for things like generative pre-trained transformers and so forth, the GPT, generative AI stuff. When you look at that, we are training it based on human behavior. We're training it based on human language, on human art, on human speech, and so forth. So you're right. The AIs that exist today are a consolidation of human learning. And that's why we've had problems with AI already demonstrating human bias, racism and sexism and things like that, because those biases exist in society. So when these models are learning, they're learning those human biases. So in the learning process that we use for AI, we have, what we call this backward propagation or feedback loops that we go through to tell an AI whether something is correct or not, whether their interpretation of that data is right, or we can sort of shepherd it in one direction or the other to remove biases, for example. But this takes intent. And what we've seen a lot of these technology companies talk about their processes internally. Google and Microsoft both have ethics councils. But the evidence is that these ethical councils have run into barriers within those tech companies. For example, getting these ethics put in place. So it's not a solution that is working as yet. But as these systems get more and more sophisticated, and we become more and more reliant on AI in society, we are going to have to get more sophisticated in terms of the guidelines and the operation of these things, and we're going to have to ensure that the operation is fair and unbiased and so forth. So we are going to have to do more work to make sure these AIs integrate into society safely and ethically.
Great. We're living a change of guard in the leadership, in the economic leadership of the world. China as GDP, if you consider the purchase parity equivalent is already greater than the United States GDP. But the nominal value will also be higher over the next years. That's what
sometime around 2032, we think China will surpass the US. So, but it's not an exact science, but yeah.
Exactly. Do you think that AI could play any role in this geopolitical dispute in the world?
Oh, absolutely. You're going to see US AI versus Chinese AI. I think that's a given. The reality is, if you look right now, China is ahead of the US in respect to AI in many areas, not necessarily in large language models and ChatGPT and things like that, but in terms of AI infrastructure built into the economy. AI is much more immersed in the Chinese society than in the United States, and more immersed in many ways than the US could ever be, I think, because of their politics and their social conditions. If you look at education in China, they have education from a grade level, from basic schooling in respect to AI, and help people understand the context of AI there. The United States, it's a specialization you only get to in university for AI, really, unless you're doing sort of stuff on the side. So if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative and the opportunity to automate supply chain, China has significant advantages there. China is deploying more solar every year right now than the total solar capacity in the United States. They are at least 10 years ahead on central bank digital currencies, programmable money, which you need for smart contracts and you need for the smart economy. They have, in terms of their systems around the operation of ports and shipping and so forth, China is obviously well advanced on that. They have smart cities like Shenzhen. They have policy on AI that has been around obviously for a few years. They have a plan for deployment of AI in society in China. The US is still debating whether they need regulation of AI or whether the tech companies can do it on their own. So there are many of the building blocks around AI that right now it appears as if China has a significant advantage in terms of leveraging AI for the future of their economy. And if you think about what the economy of 2035 or 2040 looks like, one of the biggest differentiators in the economy is how smart it is, how autonomous the economy is, how much value can be created by these algorithms and this automated infrastructure. And on that basis alone, it would seem that China has a significant advantage over the United States. So I still hear many US-based economists argue that that's never going to happen, that China is never going to surpass the US, but I think it is going to happen. And I think that the US is going to find that extremely challenging because China will use that politically. They'll say, well, obviously the US system of democracy and capitalism has failed. It had its time, but it's time for the Chinese system and things like that. And obviously Americans are going to find that pretty difficult to deal with.
Great. I still have two questions. And the first one is about warfare. Do you think that AI could change the way wars happen in the world? Would the wars get more violent, severe, and frequent, or less violent, severe, and frequent?
Well, of course, it's better to have robots fighting each other than humans, right? But having said that, when it comes to territorial disputes and things like that, you obviously could have AIs attacking humans, based on the current developments. We see drones in use frequently now in the Ukraine-Russia conflict as an example. And to think that, if there was a conflict between China and the US, that they wouldn't be using drones to attack each other, I think is sort of, ridiculous. So we need something like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that obviously was developed in the 80s and 90s. We need something like that for autonomous warfare. We need those guidelines in place. And if a robot, kills a human in warfare, then there needs to be consequences like the world courts that we see for war crimes and so forth today. There needs to be some policing around that. But certainly I think it's going to have to get to the point where it becomes a significant problem before we have that global movement to fix that. This comes back though to legal and ethics, right? One of the clear foundations for AI should be that, we go back to Asimov's 3 laws on robotics. AI should not do harm to a human. They shouldn't kill a human or enable a human to be killed, right? So this sort of basic, 10 commandments of AI, if you like, we need some sort of basic structure in there that we need to agree on. And first and foremost, it should be, we shouldn't be letting AI make a decision on killing one person or millions of people without human intervention. At a minimum.
And the last question might sound a little naive, but the thing is, if the whole world is structured over the AI paradigm, so the law system and the way the that cars go from one place to the other, the planes go from one place to the other, the way business are moved. Wouldn't the world be much more fragile? Wouldn't be a world that if you, let's say, unplug the world, there's nothing more concrete to rely on?
Interesting question. Obviously, as we've developed newer technologies like electronics, like the electrical systems, like computing platforms, communication platforms, and so forth. As these systems have developed, they've become more reliable. So if you have, excuse me, if you have a complete failure of the AI system and the system collapses, then you need to have multiple failure points across multiple physical locations simultaneously. The redundancy and so forth that we already build into things like data centers and so forth show that really the chances that someone's going to turn it off and society is going to collapse is, I think, an unwarranted concern given the automation we already have in the financial system, for example, in the stock market, other things like that. We are already reliant on AI in many aspects of our life. We use it every day. Auto-correct on your smartphone, voice-based systems, facial recognition systems. It's already embedded in society, and we don't see large-scale failures at all, really. So I don't think this is something that we should fear. What we can fear is that there are potential. Sorry.
No, please take your time.
What we do fear, or should fear to some extent, is that we may not understand how these systems make changes. Now, in some areas, that doesn't really matter. But we are going to have to get better at looking at sort of longer term implications of these systemic changes and whether they're good for society or not. And so, this comes into areas like the movement of people cross border, food production, how we mitigate against climate, things like that. Governance. For example, AI regulation. It doesn't really make sense to have an AI regulation for Brazil that's different from AI regulation in New York, right? Especially if Brazilians are using Apple or Google platforms with American AI systems built in. We really need some sort of global consensus on this. So increasingly, where we are going to get problems in society is not necessarily the automation function itself or the systems that we become reliant on. It's the fact that we are going to be even more and more interconnected as a species and as countries and cultures. And we need to figure out a way for all of that to work together better. So if anything, this needs to bring us together in respect to decision-making on regulation globally and governance globally. I'm not calling for a global government, but I do think we will need global regulation when it comes to things like artificial intelligence. And, of course, our response to climate change. I don't think it makes sense to have a national climate change policy. I think we need global action and global consensus on this. And I think the same is true of future pandemics, and how we deal with the eco-refugee crisis is going to come from climate change. We need a lot more global cooperation. And the failures in the system are much more likely to be human-based than they are machine-based.
Great. Very, very great. A very, very, very quick one to finish. Do you think this new technology of artificial intelligence will make us further apart, will make us more isolated, will make us less in contact with each other, human to human, as the internet has been making? I see my kids sometimes less with their friends and more with their little apps on their cell phones. Do you think AI might isolate us more?
I think actually the opposite is true, and I'll tell you why. is when we remove the dreary, 9 to 5, production style work that we have, and we eliminate that monotony from society. When we have more automation and more free time, we are going to look for more genuine human experiences. We're going to look for more reasons to come together, and we're going to have more time to pursue bigger goals for humanity, goals for the species itself. Things like becoming a multiplanetary species, creating free energy, solving homelessness, removing poverty. All of these are achievable with the introduction of artificial intelligence and the improvements it could bring. And this just comes really down to policy and intent. But ultimately, I think you are going to see people like we've already seen, with changes that came with the pandemic, with working from home, people have become digital nomads and are now choosing to live around the world where they can experience life a little differently now that they can work remotely. So I think this is a great analogy for the sort of freedoms that AI could bring us, and with something like universal basic income in play. If you're getting paid, say, $2,500 a month, and you're living in New York, that's not going to be great. You're not going to really live a high quality life. But if you move to Cambodia or Croatia or Ecuador or something like that, that money could go a lot further. So people could choose to have much better quality lives with this type of automation that comes with into society as well. So I think overall, it's going to bring humanity closer together with the tools that we use for just surviving as a species. That part of it's going to get much